After spilling a coffee, a millionaire yelled at a waitress in a luxury restaurant, "You wretch, you deserve to be fired." However, what happened left everyone speechless. Megan Collins moved swiftly through the elegant dining room of La Belle Maison, balancing a tray of freshly brewed coffee and delicate pastries. The restaurant, one of the most luxurious in New York, was filled with the chatter of the city's elite, their laughter and clinking glasses blending into a refined symphony. She had worked here for nearly 2 years, and despite the demanding clientele and long hours, she was grateful for the job. It paid the bills, put food on the table, and helped support her mother and younger sister. Tonight, however, was unusually hectic. The head chef was in a foul mood. The staff was stretched thin, and Megan felt the pressure weighing on her shoulders. As she approached table 12, she took a steadying breath. It was occupied by none other than Zachary Sterling, a name everyone in the restaurant industry recognized. A self-made millionaire, ruthless in business and infamous for his temper. He had a reputation that preceded him. Zachary sat with 2 associates, his crisp navy suit flawless, his Rolex catching the dim candlelight. He was in the middle of a conversation, his deep voice cutting through the ambient noise. Megan stepped forward carefully, placing the cups down, but just as she reached for the last coffee, a sudden nudge from behind threw her off balance. A gasp escaped her lips as the cup tipped, and in what felt like slow motion, dark liquid splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, some droplets even landing on Zachary's sleeve. The world froze. A suffocating silence fell over the table. Megan's heart pounded violently as she stared at the spreading stain. Her breath hitching, Zachary pushed back his chair abruptly, the legs scraping against the marble floor. His expression morphed into one of disgust and rage. "You incompetent idiot," he roared, standing so suddenly that the surrounding diners turned their heads. His piercing blue eyes burned with fury as he shook the droplets from his sleeve. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" I'm so sorry, sir," Megan stammered, mortified. She reached for a napkin, desperate to clean up the mess, but he stepped back as if her touch alone would contaminate him further. Her hands trembled. The heat of humiliation spread across her face as whispers rippled through the restaurant. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the silent pity. "Sorry," Zachary sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think sorry fixes this?" His words sliced through her like a knife. "Mr. Sterling, please," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But he wasn't done. His voice rose even louder, ensuring everyone could hear. "You shouldn't be working here if you can't handle basic service. People like you don't belong in places like this." Megan flinched as though struck. The humiliation was unbearable. Mark Holloway, the restaurant owner, rushed over, his face pale with anxiety. "Mr. Sterling, please, let's not make a scene." "Oh, there's already a scene," Zachary snapped. "And I want this mess cleaned up now." His glare shifted back to Megan, starting with her. Megan's breath hitched. Mark hesitated, glancing between them, torn between keeping a high-profile client happy and standing by his employee. But the decision was made in seconds. His expression hardened as he turned to Megan. "You're fired," he said flatly. It felt like a punch to the gut. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Megan swallowed hard, nodding stiffly as she untied her apron with trembling hands. The humiliation burned through her, but she refused to break down in front of these people. Zachary's lips curled into a smirk of satisfaction. Without another word, Megan turned and walked away. The once warm glow of the chandeliers now felt cold, the laughter of the wealthy clientele ringing hollow in her ears. She stepped out onto the freezing New York streets, the harsh wind biting at her skin. Her heart pounded, her mind spinning with disbelief. Fired. Just like that. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. How was she supposed to go home and tell her mother? How would they pay rent next month? A lump formed in her throat as she walked aimlessly, her reflection in the boutique windows looking like a ghost of herself. She wanted to scream, cry, lash out. But what good would it do? Zachary Sterling would go on with his perfect life, while she was nothing to him. Her phone buzzed again. She finally pulled it out, expecting a message from her mother. Instead, her notifications were filled with a name she never expected. Zachary Sterling. Her stomach twisted as she clicked on a link. A video had surfaced. Of the incident, the caption read, "Millionaire humiliates waitress in public. Disgusting behavior." Her pulse quickened as she scrolled through the comments. Thousands of people were already outraged. Her world had just been turned upside down. But perhaps so had Zachary's. Megan sat on the worn-out couch in the tiny apartment she shared with her mother and younger sister Emma. The place felt colder tonight, though the heating was on. She had barely spoken a word since she walked through the door hours ago. Her coat still draped over her shoulders as if she hadn't fully arrived home. Her mother, Carol, sat across from her at the small kitchen table, worry etched deep into her face. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Emma, barely 16, had her arms crossed, looking at Megan with wide, anxious eyes. "So," Carol finally said, her voice gentle but expectant, "are you going to tell us what happened?" Megan exhaled shakily. She had been dreading this moment. How could she tell them that she had lost the only thing keeping their lives afloat? She hesitated before finally forcing the words out. "I got fired!" Emma's gasp was immediate. "What?" Carol's shoulders slumped as if she had already known, but still hoped she was wrong. "Why?" Megan swallowed hard, looking down at her hands. I spilled coffee on a customer." Emma frowned. "That's it. That's why they fired you." Megan hesitated. How could she explain that it wasn't just any customer, but Zachary Sterling, one of the most influential businessmen in the city, that he had humiliated her in front of an entire restaurant, that his words still echoed in her mind, making her feel smaller than she ever had before. She glanced at her phone, which kept buzzing with notifications. The video of the incident was still spreading. She had spent the past hour scrolling through the endless stream of comments, a mix of outrage and support. People were furious at Zachary, calling him heartless, cruel, entitled. It should have made her feel better. But it didn't. Her mother reached across the table and took Megan's hand in hers. "We'll figure this out," she said softly, trying to sound confident. "You'll find another job." Megan wanted to believe her, but jobs weren't easy to come by, especially not with her limited experience. Restaurants would hesitate to hire someone who had been publicly fired, especially if the media kept digging into the story. "I'll start looking tomorrow," Megan muttered, though even as she said it, doubt weighed heavily on her chest. Emma was still fuming. "This is so unfair. I saw the video. That guy, Sterling, whatever, he was a complete jerk. He got you fired for a tiny accident, and now he gets to just keep living his perfect life." Megan didn't respond. She wasn't naive. Men like Zachary Sterling didn't face consequences. He was rich, powerful, and untouchable. Whatever backlash he faced now would blow over in a few days. He would move on. She, on the other hand, had lost everything. Carol sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, honey, I know this is hard, but we can't dwell on it. We just have to keep moving forward." Megan nodded, but her stomach churned with uncertainty. Meanwhile, Zachary Sterling paced the length of his penthouse, the city skyline glittering behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. His jaw was tight, his grip on his whiskey glass firm. "Tell me this is under control," he snapped at his assistant, James, who stood stiffly near the kitchen island. James shifted uncomfortably. "It's complicated." Zachary exhaled sharply, tossing back the last of his drink. The bitterness burned his throat, but it was nothing compared to the frustration boiling inside him. "This is ridiculous," he growled. "Some stupid waitress spills coffee, and suddenly, I'm the villain." James hesitated. "Sir, the video has over 3 million views. Major news outlets are picking it up. People are calling for boycotts on your business." Zachary clenched his jaw. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been untouchable for years. His name synonymous with power and success. He had weathered scandals before, but none had ever gained this much traction. "Who cares about public opinion?" he scoffed. "People forget these things in a week." James shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. "Not this time, sir. Several investors are reconsidering deals with Sterling Enterprises. They don't want to be associated with this kind of publicity." Zachary froze. Investors, his company was built on trust and prestige. If they started pulling out, it wouldn't just be a PR nightmare. It would be a financial disaster. His fingers curled into fists, all over a damn cup of coffee. James cleared his throat. "Sir, you might need to issue a statement, maybe even an apology." Zachary's head snapped up. "Apologize." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "To a waitress." James hesitated before nodding. "It could help smooth things over." Zachary exhaled through his nose. Rubbing his temples, he had never apologized for anything in his life. He didn't apologize, but if his business was at stake, he gritted his teeth. Draft something, make it sound professional. James nodded and turned to leave, but before he could, Zachary called after him. "And find out where that waitress is now." James hesitated. "Why?" Zachary's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I don't like unfinished business." Back at Megan's apartment, Megan scrolled through the trending topics again, watching as Zachary's name continued to dominate headlines. Rich CEO humiliates waitress. The internet fights back. Public outrage grows over Zachary Sterling's behavior. Sterling Enterprises facing backlash. Will it survive? She sighed and put the phone down. It didn't change anything. She was still jobless, still struggling. A knock at the door startled her. Emma stood up. "I'll get it." Megan barely paid attention until Emma's voice called out in confusion. "Megan, there's a guy here. He says he's a businessman." Megan frowned, standing up and walking toward the door. When she saw the man standing in the hallway, her breath caught. Samuel Ellsworth, one of the most well-known restaurant owners in the city. He smiled warmly. "Megan Collins." She hesitated. "Yes." He extended a hand. "I saw what happened to you, and I believe that sometimes talent is overlooked for all the wrong reasons." Megan's heart pounded. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Samuel said, "that I'd like to offer you an opportunity." Megan sat at the tiny kitchen table, staring at Samuel Ellsworth in disbelief. The man was legendary in the restaurant industry, known for turning struggling eateries into five-star dining experiences. His empire spanned across multiple cities, each establishment boasting a waiting list months long. And now, he was sitting in her cramped apartment, offering her something she hadn't dared to dream of. She cleared her throat, still unsure if she had heard him correctly. "You want to offer me an opportunity?" Samuel smiled warmly. "Yes, I saw the video." Megan felt her stomach drop. That video, the one where she had been humiliated, the one that had been shared millions of times, she had avoided watching it again, unable to relive the way Zachary's voice had cut through her like a blade. Samuel continued, "I don't see someone incompetent in that video. I see a young woman who was mistreated, who handled an unfair situation with grace, and I see someone with potential." Megan hesitated, unsure how to respond. Her mother, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. "Mr. Ellsworth, we appreciate your kindness, but what exactly are you offering?" Samuel leaned forward slightly, his presence radiating confidence. "A job, but not just any job. I want to train you personally. I own one of the best culinary programs in New York, and I believe you have what it takes to be more than a waitress. You can learn from the best, chefs who have worked in Michelin-starred restaurants. If you're willing to work hard, I'll give you a chance to become one of them." Megan blinked. The words felt unreal. It was too much. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Emma blurted, her voice full of excitement. Megan let out a nervous laugh. "It's not that simple." Samuel nodded. "I understand. It's a big decision. But don't take too long to decide. Opportunities like this don't come every day." He handed her a sleek business card. "Think it over if you're interested. Call me tomorrow morning." Megan took the card, running her fingers over the embossed letters. Samuel Ellsworth, CEO, restaurateur, investor. "I will," she whispered. Samuel stood, offering her one last smile. "I hope you do, because I think you have something special. Megan, don't let one man's cruelty define your worth." And with that, he was gone. Megan sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the card in her hands. Her mother reached over and squeezed her wrist. "Sweetheart, this is incredible." Emma practically bounced in her seat. "Are you kidding? It's more than incredible. This is huge. You have to say yes." Megan swallowed hard. "It's just a lot." Carol softened. "I know, but you deserve this, honey." Megan exhaled shakily. "Maybe, Maybe she did. Meanwhile, Zachary Sterling was not having a good night. He had spent the last 4 hours on the phone with publicists, lawyers, and furious investors who were threatening to pull out of ongoing deals. He had assumed this ridiculous scandal would fade in a day, but the outrage was only growing. His assistant, James, stood across from him in his home office, nervously flipping through a stack of printed headlines. "Millionaire Humiliates Waitress. Public calls for boycott," James read aloud. He flipped to another page. "Sterling Enterprises stock drops after viral incident." And, oh, this one is particularly bad. "Zachary Sterling's true colors, arrogance, and elitism exposed." Zachary rubbed his temples, his patience wearing thin. "Enough." James hesitated. "Sir, there's one more thing." Zachary looked up sharply. James shifted on his feet before placing his phone on the desk. The screen displayed a video. Zachary recognized it instantly. The video, the one that started this mess. But this wasn't just a copy of the original clip. No, this was a reaction video from one of the biggest influencers in the business world. As James hit play, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and sharp green eyes appeared on the screen. "This is absolutely disgusting," she said. "I don't care how rich you are. No human being should treat another person this way. Zachary Sterling just showed the world who he really is. A privileged, entitled man who thinks he can step on people without consequences." Zachary's teeth clenched. "Oh, but it gets worse," the woman continued. "While Sterling Enterprises crumbles, guess who's thriving? Megan Collins. Yeah, the waitress he tried to ruin. She's just been offered a job by none other than Samuel Ellsworth himself." Zachary's fingers tightened into fists. James cleared his throat. "It's everywhere, sir. People are celebrating her." Zachary hated losing. He had spent years building his empire, crushing competitors, ensuring that nothing and no one could stand in his way. And yet, he had lost to a waitress. His jaw tightened. "Find out where she's working now." James hesitated. "Sir, what are you planning?" Zachary's lips curled into a cold smile. "I don't like unfinished business." Back at Megan's apartment, Megan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She should have been happy, excited, overwhelmed with gratitude, and yet, all she could feel was fear. What if she failed? What if she wasn't good enough? She needed this job, but more than that, she needed to prove, to herself, to the world, that she was more than the girl Zachary Sterling had humiliated. A deep breath, a decision. She reached for her phone. Samuel's card lay on her nightstand, his number printed in elegant gold letters. With a steadying breath, she dialed. It rang once, twice. Then, Samuel Ellsworth speaking. Megan gripped the phone tighter. "I'm in," she said, a small chuckle on the other end. "Good. You won't regret it." Megan hoped he was right. Because this wasn't just about getting a job anymore. This was about taking control of her life. And no one, not even Zachary Sterling, was going to take that from her again. Megan arrived at Ellsworth Fine Dining the next morning with her heart pounding in her chest. The restaurant was nothing like La Belle Maison. It wasn't just luxurious. It was an institution, a place where the most respected food critics dined, where reservations had to be made months in advance, and where every detail, from the arrangement of the silverware to the precise plating of dishes, was an art form. She stepped inside, inhaling the scent of fresh herbs and butter sizzling on cast-iron pans. The kitchen, visible through glass windows, buzzed with controlled chaos. Chefs working with the precision of surgeons, their movements synchronized, their voices clipped and efficient. And now, she was here. A host greeted her with a professional nod and led her through the sleek marble floor to Samuel Ellsworth's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear his deep, confident voice. "We need to ensure that the consistency remains. No shortcuts. Excellence is the only standard we accept." A pause, then, "Come in, Megan." She stepped inside, nerves tightening in her stomach. Samuel sat behind a dark mahogany desk, dressed impeccably in a navy suit, his piercing gaze studying her as if already measuring her potential. She swallowed. "Good morning, Mr. Ellsworth." He gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit." Megan obeyed, clasping her hands to keep them from trembling. "I appreciate you coming in," he said. But let me be clear, This will not be easy. She straightened. I don't expect it to be. His lips quirked in the faintest hint of approval. Good, because I don't take in people who expect shortcuts. If you accept my offer, you will start at the bottom. You will scrub dishes, prep ingredients, and learn every inch of the kitchen before you even touch a plate for service. This isn't about sympathy, Megan. It's about potential. Megan exhaled slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't charity. This was a test. I understand, she said, meeting his gaze. I'll prove myself. Samuel leaned back, nodding slightly. Then you start tomorrow. Her breath hitched. That fast. Yes, I'll be here. He stood, extending a hand. She shook it, feeling the firm grip of a man who had built his empire from nothing. Then welcome to Ellsworth Fine Dining, he said, as she walked out of his office. The realization hit her. This was the first step toward something bigger, and she was ready. Across the city, Zachary Sterling sat in his sleek penthouse, his fingers tapping restlessly against his desk. The backlash hadn't died down. If anything, it had worsened. Headlines still smeared his name, and now some of his biggest investors were pulling out. His team had managed to keep the worst of the financial damage contained, but the cracks were showing, and the worst part, the waitress, Megan Collins, was now the darling of the culinary world. Samuel Ellsworth had swooped in and turned her into some rags-to-riches success story. The narrative had shifted. Megan wasn't just the girl he had humiliated. She was now the symbol of perseverance, and people loved it. It made him sick. James, his assistant, stood by hesitantly, holding a stack of reports. Sir, I think we need to discuss damage control. Zachary exhaled sharply. Give me something useful, James, not the same PR nonsense. James hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, There's one possible move left. Zachary's eyes narrowed. Go on. An apology, James said, carefully watching Zachary's reaction. A public one. The word alone made Zachary's teeth clench. He didn't apologize. He never apologized. James shifted. If you don't, this might never go away. Zachary stared at him for a long moment. Then, finally, he smirked. There's more than one way to fix this. James frowned. What do you mean? Zachary leaned forward, a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. I think it's time I paid Megan Collins a visit. Megan spent her first day at Ellsworth Fine Dining scrubbing pans. By midday, her arms ached, her back throbbed, and she had lost count of how many times she had wiped sweat from her forehead. No one treated her with special kindness. No one acknowledged the viral video or the scandal that had brought her here. In the kitchen, she was just another new recruit, and that was exactly how she wanted it. But as exhausting as the work was, she found herself loving it. The smell of fresh ingredients, the clatter of knives against cutting boards, the hum of the kitchen. She was part of something now. Late into the evening, after what felt like an eternity, she finally stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The alley behind the restaurant was dimly lit, the cool air brushing against her flushed skin. She closed her eyes, exhaling, and then, a voice. Well. Her eyes snapped open, her heart plunging. Zachary Sterling stood a few feet away, leaning casually against the brick wall. Her blood turned cold. What are you doing here? She demanded, her pulse racing. His smirk was infuriatingly calm. Just came to talk. Megan crossed her arms. I have nothing to say to you. He took a slow step closer, his eyes glinting in the low light. You sure about that? Megan's fists clenched. This man, this arrogant, entitled man, had the audacity to show up here after everything. I don't care what you want, she said, voice sharp. Leave. Zachary chuckled, tilting his head. You've certainly grown some fire since the last time we met. Megan narrowed her eyes. That girl you humiliated, she's gone. For a flicker of a moment, something shifted in his gaze, something unreadable. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks. We'll see about that. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Megan standing in the alley, her heart pounding. What the hell had just happened? And why did she have the awful feeling that this wasn't over? Megan spent the rest of the night tossing and turning in bed, her mind replaying her brief but unsettling encounter with Zachary Sterling. The audacity, the nerve. After everything, he had the gall to show up at her new workplace, acting as if she owed him a conversation. She clenched her jaw, staring at the ceiling. She should have told Samuel, but a part of her, perhaps the stubborn part, refused to let Zachary believe he still had any power over her. He was nothing to her now. Tomorrow, she would go to work, put her head down, and focus on her future, not him. With that resolve, she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Megan arrived at Ellsworth Fine Dining at the crack of dawn. The moment she stepped into the kitchen, the chaos swallowed her whole. The scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the sharp tang of citrus and herbs. Pans sizzled, knives chopped with rapid precision, and the sous chef barked orders like a commander on a battlefield. Megan tied her apron tightly, ready to prove herself. She started at the prep station, slicing onions, peeling garlic, and chopping parsley until her fingers ached. Every move had to be precise. No wasted motion, no sloppy work. The head chef, a stern woman named Danielle, scrutinized her every move. "Faster," Danielle muttered as she passed by. Megan picked up the pace, determined not to fall behind. The hours blurred together. She learned the rhythm of the kitchen, the way orders flowed, the dance of the chefs moving in tandem, the quiet language of nods and gestures. By the time the lunch rush ended, Megan had barely taken a breath. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, exhaustion creeping into her bones, but a deep sense of satisfaction settled in her chest. She belonged here. Danielle gave her a once-over, then nodded. "Not bad for your first day," Megan exhaled in relief. From Danielle, that was practically a compliment. But just as she thought she might get a moment to breathe, one of the servers rushed into the kitchen, his face pale. Megan, there's someone asking for you." Megan frowned, untying her apron. "Who?" The server hesitated. "You might want to see for yourself." Something in his tone made her stomach clench. She stepped out of the kitchen and into the dining area, and there he was, Zachary Sterling, sitting at a table, perfectly at ease, as if he belonged here. Megan's blood boiled. She marched toward him, hands clenched. "You have got to be kidding me." Zachary looked up, unfazed. "Good afternoon." "Megan?" She stared at him, barely able to contain her rage. "Are you serious? What the hell are you doing here?" He leaned back in his chair, completely unbothered. "Having lunch," she narrowed her eyes. "In this restaurant," Zachary smirked. "I've always been a fan of fine dining," Megan scoffed. "Cut the crap. What do you really want?" He studied her for a long moment, then finally sighed. "Fine, I came to talk." Megan folded her arms. "We have nothing to talk about." He tilted his head slightly. "I think we do." She shook her head, stepping back. "Enjoy your lunch, then leave." She turned on her heel, heading straight for the kitchen. "I want to offer you a deal." Megan froze mid-step. Slowly, she turned back. "Excuse me." Zachary rested his elbows on the table, his gaze unreadable. "A business proposal." She let out a humorless laugh. "You're out of your mind if you think I'd ever do business with you." He remained calm. "You might want to hear me out before you decide." Megan hesitated, every instinct telling her to walk away. But curiosity, or maybe sheer disbelief, got the better of her. She sat down across from him, arms crossed. "You have 5 minutes." Zachary exhaled, as if relieved she was even listening. "I need a way to fix my image," he admitted. "And you, well, you're the biggest name in the city right now." Megan's jaw tightened. "Because you humiliated me." His expression didn't change. "Yes." The blunt acknowledgement caught her off guard. He leaned in slightly. "We both know how the media works. They love a good redemption story. If I can publicly support your career, it might shift the narrative." Megan stared at him in disbelief. "Let me get this straight. You want to use me to clean up your mess?" Zachary's lips pressed into a thin line. "You'd benefit too." She let out a sharp laugh. "And how exactly do I benefit?" Zachary didn't blink. "Connections. Investors. Exposure. You want to own a restaurant someday, don't you?" Megan's stomach twisted because he wasn't wrong, but that didn't mean she would sell herself out. She leaned forward, her voice low and dangerous. "Let me make something very clear to you, Zachary. I don't need you. I got here without you, and I will succeed without you." His jaw ticked slightly, but he said nothing. Megan stood. "So, here's my counteroffer. You get up, you walk out that door, and you never bother me again." She turned to leave, but just as she stepped away, Zachary spoke again, his voice lower this time. "You're making a mistake." Megan glanced back over her shoulder. "No," she said coldly. "I'm making a choice." She walked away, leaving Zachary sitting there for once in his life, powerless. Megan stormed back into the kitchen, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The nerve of that man, the absolute audacity. She ripped off her apron and tossed it onto the counter, inhaling sharply to calm herself, but her hands were still trembling. Whether from anger or adrenaline, she wasn't sure. Danielle, the head chef, glanced up from the grill, raising an eyebrow. "You look like you're about to stab someone. Should I be concerned?" Megan exhaled through her nose. "Not unless Zachary Sterling walks through that door again." Danielle snorted. "That the rich prick who humiliated you?" Megan gave a tight nod, and Danielle shook her head. "Figured. I saw the video." She went back to flipping a steak, barely sparing Megan a glance. "You want to go scream into the freezer for a minute? Helps me when I want to punch someone." Megan let out a short, breathy laugh despite herself. "I'm fine," Danielle shrugged. "Suit yourself, but don't let some entitled bastard mess with your head. He's not worth it." Megan knew that, but Zachary had always been able to get away with whatever he wanted. People bent over backward for him, forgave him, handed him opportunities on silver platters. And now, the first time he had to face real consequences, he wanted to use her as a stepping stone to rebuild himself. She clenched her jaw. Not a chance. For the rest of her shift, Megan threw herself into her work, chopping, stirring, plating, anything to keep herself moving by the time the evening rush died down. Exhaustion weighed heavy on her bones, but her mind still raced with frustration. As she stepped out onto the street, the cool night air brushed against her flushed skin. She took a deep breath, letting the crispness clear her head. Then her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, half expecting another wave of news notifications about Zachary's downfall. But it wasn't the news. It was him. Her stomach twisted as she read the message. "Zachary Sterling, you should reconsider my offer. It's not just my reputation at stake, it's your future too." Megan stared at the screen, incredulous. Did this man truly not understand the word no? Fury surged through her veins. Without thinking, she typed back, "Megan Collins, the only thing I'm reconsidering is why I even wasted 5 minutes listening to you. Leave me alone." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. A moment later, the little read receipt appeared. Read at 11:03 p.m. Good. Let him sit with that. She locked her phone, shoving it into her jacket pocket, and started walking home. But as much as she hated to admit it, his words lingered in the back of her mind. Across town, Zachary stared at his phone, his jaw tightening at Megan's reply. She was making this difficult. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to fire back another message, but something held him back. Pushing too hard would make him look desperate, and Zachary Sterling did not do desperate. Still, frustration curled in his chest. He needed control back. He had always been the one calling the shots, the one who dictated how things went. But ever since that damn video, he'd been losing. Deals, investors, credibility. He needed a way to turn the tides, and Megan was the key to that. Yet she had the audacity to reject him. Zachary downed the rest of his scotch, the burn doing little to numb the bitter taste in his mouth. Maybe it was time to rethink his approach. The next morning, Megan woke up feeling lighter. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was in control of her own life again. Zachary's games, his manipulations, they weren't her problem anymore. She got dressed, grabbed a quick breakfast, and headed to work with purpose in her step when she arrived at Ellsworth Fine Dining. Samuel was already waiting for her by the bar, a newspaper in hand. He lifted it when she approached. "Sterling's empire continues to crumble. Investors jump ship." Megan raised an eyebrow. "I assume this is supposed to make me feel better." Samuel smirked. "A little vindication never hurts." She shook her head. "I don't care what happens to him." Samuel studied her for a moment, then set the newspaper down. "Good, because you have more important things to focus on." Megan nodded, but even as she walked toward the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, and she was right. Because later that evening, As the restaurant buzzed with customers, a murmur rippled through the dining area. Megan was at the prep station when one of the servers rushed in. Megan, you need to see this." She wiped her hands on a towel and stepped out into the main room, and froze, because sitting at the bar, cool and composed, was Zachary Sterling. Again, but this time, he wasn't alone. A group of investors sat with him, engaged in quiet conversation. The air around them felt calculated, deliberate. Megan's stomach turned. This wasn't just coincidence. This was a move. She turned sharply, marching straight back to Samuel's office. She didn't knock, just pushed open the door. Samuel looked up from his paperwork, mildly amused. "Megan?" She gestured behind her. "He's here." Samuel leaned back. "I know." Her brows furrowed. "You knew." He sighed, rubbing his temple. Zachary reached out, wanted to discuss mutually beneficial opportunities. Megan's jaw clenched. "And you let him in?" Samuel studied her carefully. "I wanted to see what he was up to." Megan exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "He's trying to use me. Again, he wants to fix his image by dragging me into his mess." Samuel nodded slowly. "I figured as much." He stood, straightening his suit. "But let's make one thing clear. This is your decision. If you want him gone, I'll have him removed." Megan hesitated. She wanted to say yes. She wanted him out of her life for good, but something about this felt different. If Zachary thought he could manipulate her again, he was wrong. She squared her shoulders. "I'll handle it." Samuel smirked. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." Megan turned on her heel and walked back out, her heart pounding. This time, when she approached Zachary, she wasn't scared, she wasn't intimidated, she was ready. And Zachary, for the first time, he wasn't the one in control anymore. Megan walked toward Zachary with measured steps, her expression unreadable. The hum of the restaurant faded into the background, drowned out by the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Zachary noticed her approach before she even reached him. He turned slightly in his seat, resting an elbow on the bar as if he had all the time in the world. The corners of his mouth curled into something that resembled a smirk. But there was something calculated about the way he was watching her. Megan didn't stop until she was standing right in front of him. "You're persistent," she said coolly. Zachary raised an eyebrow. "I prefer the term determined." Her eyes flicked to the group of men sitting beside him. They were dressed in tailored suits, their presence radiating power and wealth, investors. So that was his game. He wasn't here just to get in her head. He was showing off, trying to reestablish his status by parading himself around one of the city's top restaurants, pretending that everything was fine. Megan folded her arms. "Enjoying your meal?" Zachary tilted his head slightly. "I will be, once we discuss business." She let out a dry laugh. "There is no business to discuss." One of the investors cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling speaks very highly of this restaurant and of you, Miss Collins." Megan stiffened. "What?" Zachary took a sip of his whiskey, completely at ease. "Megan is one of the most promising names in the culinary industry. I've been keeping a close eye on her career." Megan's nails dug into her palm. He was playing her. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile. "That's funny, because the last time you acknowledged my existence, you were trying to ruin my life." One of the investors shifted uncomfortably. Zachary, however, remained unfazed. "That was an unfortunate misunderstanding," he said smoothly. Megan let out a slow breath. "Stay calm. Stay in control." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're trying to rewrite history," she murmured. "And you're using me to do it." Zachary's smirk didn't falter. "I'm offering an opportunity." Megan held his gaze. "No, you're trying to manipulate the narrative." Again. His eyes flickered with something unreadable for the briefest moment, but then it was gone. Megan straightened, raising her voice just enough for the investors to hear. "Well, gentlemen, I appreciate your interest in Ellsworth Fine Dining, but I don't take recommendations from people who believe humiliating employees is acceptable behavior." One of the men coughed into his napkin. Megan turned to the bartender. "Their drinks are on me. After that, they can find another place to discuss business." Zachary's smirk finally faltered, just slightly. The investors exchanged glances, uncertain. One of them cleared his throat. "Perhaps another time, Zachary." With that, they stood, murmuring polite goodbyes before making their way toward the exit. Megan turned back to Zachary. He was still sitting there, his fingers curled loosely around his glass, watching her carefully. "You just cost me a deal," he murmured. Megan raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" A muscle in his jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might snap, that his legendary temper would finally crack through his composed mask. But instead, he let out a quiet chuckle. "Well played." "Collins?" Megan tilted her head. "I learned from the best." He studied her, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You're not the same girl from that night." "No," she said. "I'm not." Silence stretched between them. Then Zachary finished his drink, stood and adjusted his suit. "This isn't over." Megan crossed her arms. "It is for me," he smirked. But there was something different about it this time. Less arrogance. More something else. And then, just like that, he turned and walked out of the restaurant. Megan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had won. But why didn't it feel like the end? Later that night, Samuel found her in the kitchen, quietly cleaning up. "I heard about your little showdown," he said casually. Megan glanced up. Word travels fast. Samuel leaned against the counter. "You handled it well," she exhaled, leaning back against the counter. "I should feel relieved, but I don't." Samuel studied her. "Because you know men like Zachary Sterling don't just walk away." Megan swallowed. "Exactly," Samuel nodded. "Then be ready." She met his gaze. "I will be." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that Zachary's next move was already in motion. And she had no idea what it would be. Back at his penthouse, Zachary sat in his leather chair, whiskey in hand, staring at the city skyline. The distant hum of traffic and flashing lights did little to distract him. Megan Collins had humiliated him. Publicly. That was twice now. She wasn't playing the role he had expected. Instead of being intimidated, she had outmaneuvered him. Instead of backing down, she had turned his own investors against him. His fingers tightened around the glass. There was something infuriating about her. And yet, something else. Zachary had built his empire by reading people, understanding what made them tick, what made them break. But Megan, she was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what his next move should be. His phone buzzed. "James?" Zachary sighed and answered. "Sir," James said carefully. "There's something you should see." Zachary pinched the bridge of his nose. "If it's another headline about how I'm the villain of the century, I don't want to hear it. It's not that." A pause. "It's about Megan Collins." Zachary sat up straighter. "Go on." James hesitated. "She's not just working at Ellsworth Fine Dining anymore." Zachary frowned. "What do you mean?" James cleared his throat. "I did some digging. Samuel Ellsworth isn't just training her, he's preparing her." Zachary's eyes narrowed. "For what?" A beat of silence. Then James said, "To open her own restaurant." Zachary's grip on his glass tightened. So that was her game. She wasn't just content with winning. She was coming for everything. His lips curled into a slow, dark smirk. "Well," he murmured, swirling the whiskey in his glass, "let's see how she handles some real competition. Because if Megan Collins thought she had beaten him, she was dead wrong. This wasn't over. Not even close." Megan wiped her hands on her apron, exhaling slowly. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Zachary still buzzed through her veins, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. The kitchen was still running at full speed, and she had work to do. She grabbed a fresh cutting board, focused on prepping the next batch of ingredients. But Samuel's words echoed in her mind. "Then be ready." Samuel was right. Zachary wasn't the type to walk away from a fight, especially not one he had lost in public. Megan gritted her teeth and kept chopping. Whatever his next move was, she would be ready. Across town, Zachary leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against his desk as he stared at the report James had just handed him. Samuel Ellsworth had never personally mentored anyone. Until now. That meant something. And Megan Collins, she wasn't just some ex-waitress getting a lucky break. She was being prepared to become his competition. Zachary smirked, tossing the file onto his desk. Well, if Megan wanted to play in the big leagues, it was time she learned how ruthless the industry could be. Megan's next few weeks at Ellsworth Fine Dining were brutal. Samuel was pushing her harder than ever, throwing her into every aspect of the business. She shadowed the head chef during service, learned how to balance food costs, even sat in on meetings with suppliers. It was exhausting, but Megan thrived on it. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just working to survive, she was building something. Late one evening, after the last customers had left, she was cleaning up when Samuel walked in. He placed a thick folder on the counter. "You're ready," Megan blinked. "Ready for what?" Samuel smiled. "To take the next step." She hesitated before slowly opening the folder. Inside were business plans, location scouting reports, potential investors. Megan's breath caught. "This is..." She looked up at him. "You really think I can do this?" Samuel's gaze was steady. "I wouldn't waste my time if I didn't." Emotion swelled in her chest. This was it. The chance she never thought she'd get. Megan took a deep breath, steeling herself. She was ready, but the next morning, everything changed. The first sign that something was wrong came when Megan walked into work and found the kitchen staff murmuring in hushed voices. She frowned. "What's going on?" Danielle, the head chef, looked up. "You haven't seen the news." Megan shook her head. Danielle handed her a tablet. "Read it yourself." Megan's stomach dropped as she scanned the headline. Zachary Sterling to open exclusive fine dining restaurant. The biggest culinary event of the year. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the tablet as she read further. Zachary had announced a brand new restaurant, right in the heart of the city, and it was opening in 6 months. Her pulse pounded in her ears. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was the restaurant. The one designed to dominate the fine dining scene, featuring world-renowned chefs, exclusive clientele, and an unlimited budget. Zachary was making his move. Samuel walked in at that moment, his expression unreadable. "I take it you've seen the news?" Megan looked up, her jaw tight. "This isn't a coincidence." "No," Samuel agreed. "It's a direct challenge." Megan exhaled sharply. Of course, Zachary wouldn't let her rise without throwing obstacles in her way. This wasn't just about his reputation anymore. He was actively trying to crush her before she even got started. Danielle crossed her arms. "The timing is too perfect. He must have had this planned for a while." Megan shook her head. "No, he didn't decide until after our confrontation." She swallowed hard. "This is his response." Samuel studied her carefully. "So what are you going to do?" Megan clenched her jaw. "I'm not backing down." Samuel smiled. "Good." But Megan knew this wouldn't be easy. If Zachary was coming for her, she'd come for him right back. Zachary swirled his whiskey, watching as his head chef laid out the initial menu ideas for his new restaurant. It was a masterpiece. Every dish had been carefully curated. The wine pairings were impeccable. The interior design, flawless. But his focus wasn't on the menu. It was on Megan. James hesitated before speaking. "She's going to fight back." Zachary smirked. "I know." James sighed. "You're making this personal." Zachary leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming. "It is personal." James hesitated. "What if she wins?" Zachary's smirk widened. "She won't." He lifted his glass. "Let the games begin." Megan didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at her tiny kitchen table, planning. If Zachary wanted a war, she'd give him one by the time morning came. She had one clear thought. It was time to build her empire, and no one, not even Zachary Sterling, was going to stop her. Megan stood in front of the large whiteboard in Samuel's office, her arms crossed as she studied the strategy they had begun mapping out. Locations, investors, menu concepts. Everything was being pieced together. But now, the stakes were even higher. Zachary Sterling had declared war, and Megan had no intention of losing. Samuel leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. "You've been quiet." Megan exhaled, tapping the marker against the board. "I'm thinking." Danielle, who had been sitting in the corner, arms crossed, smirked. "I know that look. You're planning something." Megan met Samuel's gaze. "I want to move faster." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Faster. We were going to take our time, build things the right way," she said. "But now, Zachary is trying to corner the market before I even get started. If we don't move quickly, he's going to use his reputation and resources to make sure we never get off the ground." Samuel considered this for a moment, nodding slowly. "So what do you propose?" Megan turned back to the board. "We open before him." Danielle let out a low whistle. That's bold. Samuel's expression didn't change. It's risky. I know, Megan admitted. But it's the only way. If we wait, his restaurant will dominate the press. Every critic, every food blogger, every industry leader will be there on opening night. And by the time we launch, we'll be fighting to get attention. Samuel leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Opening a restaurant isn't just about speed, Megan. It's about quality, execution, sustainability. He narrowed his eyes. If we move too quickly and fail, there's no second chance. Megan took a deep breath. Then we don't fail. Danielle let out a short laugh. Easy for you to say. But Samuel was still watching her. Silent, considering. Megan knew this was a risk, but she also knew Zachary. He was expecting her to react defensively, to struggle, to fight for scraps. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She was going to beat him to the punch. Finally, Samuel nodded. All right, we move up the timeline, but that means we need to secure investors now. Megan squared her shoulders. Then let's start making calls. Meanwhile, in his own high-rise office, Zachary Sterling was reading over a list of confirmed investors for his new restaurant. James stood across from him, shifting slightly as he waited for a response. Zachary tapped his finger against the paper. This is good. Yes. Sir? But I want more. James hesitated. More? Zachary set the papers down, fixing his assistant with a sharp gaze. I don't just want the biggest investors. I want exclusivity. James frowned. Meaning? Zachary smirked. Meaning I want to lock down the top-tier suppliers, the best PR firms, the best designers, before Megan Collins even has a chance to pick up the scraps. James shifted. That's aggressive. Zachary's smirk didn't waver. She made this a fight. I'm just making sure I win. James hesitated, but then nodded. I'll start reaching out. Zachary leaned back in his chair, satisfied. By the time Megan realized what he had done, it would be too late. Megan sat across from the first potential investor, hands folded neatly in her lap. The man in front of her, Robert Langford, was one of the most respected investors in the restaurant industry. He had the power to make or break a new venture, and Megan knew that if she could convince him to back her, others would follow. He adjusted his glasses, flipping through the proposal. Your plan is ambitious. Megan nodded. I believe in it. Langford studied her. You're young, new to this level of the industry. Megan met his gaze without hesitation. And I'm hungry. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. That's what I like to hear. He set the proposal down. Tell me something, Miss Collins. Why should I back you instead of Zachary Sterling? Megan's jaw tightened, but she didn't let the emotion show. She leaned forward slightly. Because Zachary Sterling is building an empire. I'm building an experience. Langford raised an eyebrow. Go on. Megan exhaled. His restaurant will be flawless, extravagant, untouchable. But people don't fall in love with perfection. They fall in love with passion, with storytelling, with something real. That's what I'm offering. A restaurant that doesn't just serve food. It tells a story. Langford tapped his fingers on the desk. Considering then, slowly, he smiled. I like you, Miss Collins. Megan's breath hitched. Langford reached for a pen and signed the contract. You have my investment. Megan's fingers curled around the edges of her chair to keep from shaking. She had done it. She had won her first battle when Zachary received the news that Robert Langford had invested in Megan's restaurant. He nearly snapped his glass in half. James stood carefully at the side of the room as if anticipating an explosion. Zachary's lips curled. She's faster than I thought. James cleared his throat. It gets worse. Zachary's eyes snapped to him. James hesitated before saying, She's moved up her launch date. Zachary went completely still. For the first time since this whole thing started, he felt something unexpected. Respect. Megan Collins was not playing defense. She was coming for him. Zachary set his glass down. Standing slowly, he adjusted his cuffs, his smirk returning. All right, Collins, he murmured. Let's see what you've got. The war had officially begun. Megan barely had time to breathe. From the moment she secured Langford's investment, the countdown had begun. Every minute mattered. Every decision had consequences. If she wanted to beat Zachary, she had to build something incredible, and she had to do it fast. She threw herself into the work. She scouted locations, met with contractors, negotiated deals with suppliers. Every day was a whirlwind of decisions, from menu development to interior design, from hiring staff to marketing strategies. There was no room for hesitation. Every time exhaustion crept in, she reminded herself of one simple truth: she was going to win, and nothing, not even Zachary Sterling, was going to stop her. But Zachary, he wasn't sitting idle either. While Megan worked to build something from scratch, Zachary had resources, connections, an army of experts at his disposal, and he was using them. James sat across from him in the dimly lit office, scrolling through the latest updates. "Collins is moving fast, too fast. She's pushing her launch to just 4 months from now." Zachary smirked. "Impressive." James frowned. "That doesn't worry you." Zachary swirled his whiskey. "It would, if I didn't already know she's about to hit a wall." James hesitated. "What do you mean?" Zachary leaned back. "Speed comes with risks, mistakes. If she rushes this, she'll crumble under the pressure, and when she does..." He took a slow sip. "I'll be waiting." James didn't respond right away. He was quiet for a moment before finally saying, "What if she doesn't fail?" Zachary's smirk didn't falter. "She will. But Megan, she wasn't making mistakes. She was thriving. Her days started before sunrise and stretched long into the night. Every morning, she met with her team at the construction site. Every afternoon, she worked on perfecting the menu. Every evening, she studied business strategies, competitor analysis, anything to give her an edge. Danielle, who had officially signed on as her head chef, watched her in awe. "You never stop," she said one night as they sat in Megan's small apartment, eating takeout between meetings. Megan shook her head. "I can't afford to." Danielle smirked. "You love this, don't you?" Megan hesitated, then nodded. "I do, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was building something that mattered, and the thought of losing, that wasn't an option." But then, the first roadblock hit. One morning, she arrived at the construction site to find Samuel standing outside. Arms crossed, his face tight, her stomach clenched. "What's wrong?" Samuel sighed, handing her a document. "We have a problem." Megan scanned the paper, her pulse spiking, a delay notice. Her contractor had just informed them that a key shipment of materials had been postponed, for at least a month. Megan's grip tightened on the page. "No, we can't afford a delay," Samuel exhaled. "I know." She looked up at him. "Who's behind this?" Samuel hesitated. Megan already knew the answer. "Zachary." Her pulse pounded. Samuel ran a hand through his hair. "I don't have proof, but..." "It's him," Megan said firmly. "Of course it's him." Zachary wanted her to fall behind. He was counting on it. Megan set her jaw. Well, he was about to be disappointed. Zachary sat at his desk later that evening, watching as James set down a report. "She's found a workaround," James admitted. "She's sourcing materials from a secondary supplier." Zachary's fingers tapped against the desk. "That was fast," James nodded. "She's relentless." Zachary smirked. "Good." James frowned. "You don't seem bothered." Zachary leaned back. "Because I'm not." Megan was fighting back, and he found that interesting. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Megan worked harder than ever. She secured her new materials, adjusted the timeline, and kept moving forward. But Zachary, he wasn't done playing. One evening, as Megan sat in a meeting with Samuel, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her stomach dropped. Breaking news. Zachary Sterling's restaurant to feature exclusive, never-before-seen concept. A game-changer for fine dining. Her blood ran cold as she read the article. He was one step ahead. Again. Megan clenched her fists. Zachary had just raised the stakes. But if he thought she was going to back down, he didn't know her at all. She wasn't just playing the game. She was here to win it. Megan barely had time to breathe. From the moment she secured Langford's investment, the countdown had begun. Every minute mattered. Every decision had consequences. If she wanted to beat Zachary, she had to build something incredible. And she had to do it fast. She threw herself into the work. She scouted locations, met with contractors, negotiated deals with suppliers. Every day was a whirlwind of decisions. From menu development to interior design. from hiring staff to marketing strategies. There was no room for hesitation. Every time exhaustion crept in, she reminded herself of one simple truth: she was going to win, and nothing, not even Zachary Sterling, was going to stop her. But Zachary, he wasn't sitting idle either. While Megan worked to build something from scratch, Zachary had resources, connections, an army of experts at his disposal, and he was using them. James sat across from him in the dimly lit office, scrolling through the latest updates. Collins is moving fast. Too fast. She's pushing her launch to just 4 months from now. Zachary smirked. Impressive, James frowned. That doesn't worry you. Zachary swirled his whiskey. It would, if I didn't already know she's about to hit a wall. James hesitated. What do you mean? Zachary leaned back. Speed comes with risks. Mistakes, if she rushes this, she'll crumble under the pressure. And when she does, he took a slow sip. I'll be waiting. James didn't respond right away. He was quiet for a moment before finally saying, What if she doesn't fail? Zachary's smirk didn't falter. She will. But Megan, she wasn't making mistakes. She was thriving. Her days started before sunrise and stretched long into the night. Every morning, she met with her team at the construction site. Every afternoon, she worked on perfecting the menu. Every evening, she studied business strategies, competitor analysis, anything to give her an edge. Danielle, who had officially signed on as her head chef, watched her in awe. You never stop, she said one night as they sat in Megan's small apartment, eating takeout between meetings. Megan shook her head. I can't afford to. Danielle smirked. You love this, don't you? Megan hesitated, then nodded. I do. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was building something that mattered. And the thought of losing, that wasn't an option. But then, the first roadblock hit. One morning, she arrived at the construction site to find Samuel standing outside, arms crossed, his face tight, her stomach clenched. What's wrong? Samuel sighed, handing her a document. We have a problem. Megan scanned the paper, her pulse spiking. A delay notice. Her contractor had just informed them that a key shipment of materials had been postponed. For at least a month, Megan's grip tightened on the page. No, we can't afford a delay, Samuel exhaled. I know. She looked up at him. Who's behind this? Samuel hesitated. Megan already knew the answer, Zachary. Her pulse pounded. Samuel ran a hand through his hair. I don't have proof, but it's him, Megan said firmly. Of course it's him. Zachary wanted her to fall behind. He was counting on it. Megan set her jaw. Well, he was about to be disappointed. Zachary sat at his desk later that evening, watching as James set down a report. She's found a workaround, James admitted. She's sourcing materials from a secondary supplier? Zachary's fingers tapped against the desk. That was fast, James nodded. She's relentless. Zachary smirked. Good. James frowned. You don't seem bothered. Zachary leaned back. Because I'm not. Megan was fighting back, and he found that interesting. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Megan worked harder than ever. She secured her new materials, adjusted the timeline, and kept moving forward. But Zachary, he wasn't done playing. One evening, as Megan sat in a meeting with Samuel, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her stomach dropped. Breaking news. Zachary Sterling's restaurant to feature exclusive, never-before-seen concept. A game-changer for fine dining. Her blood ran cold as she read the article. Zachary had just raised the stakes. His new restaurant wouldn't just be an elite fine dining experience. It would feature a never-before-seen interactive culinary concept. Something so unique, so exclusive, that the industry was already buzzing with speculation. Megan's fists clenched as she scanned the article. Every major food critic, every luxury magazine, every influencer in the industry was already talking about it. Zachary had successfully shifted the conversation. Now, instead of people talking about his past scandal, they were obsessed with what he was planning. And worse, they were doubting her. The comment section was brutal. Megan Collins is talented, but let's be honest, she's not in Sterling's league. Zachary just crushed her before she even opened. She's ambitious, but can she actually compete with a man who's been running empires for years? Megan's stomach twisted. This was exactly what Zachary wanted. He had taken control of the narrative again, and if she didn't do something now, she'd be left in his shadow. She exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. She needed to think. Zachary's biggest strength was his money, influence, and spectacle, and he knew how to dominate a market, how to make sure that everyone was talking about him. Fine. If he wanted to play that game, she'd give him something to talk about. Megan turned to Samuel, her eyes burning with determination. "We need to change the plan." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Megan's pulse pounded, her mind racing. "We need to make our restaurant more than just a place to eat." She met his gaze. "We need to make it an experience people can't ignore." A slow, knowing smile spread across Samuel's face. "Now we're talking." Megan clenched her fists, her determination solidifying. Zachary wanted a war. She'd give him one. Megan barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Zachary had once again seized control of the narrative. His upcoming restaurant was all anyone could talk about. And now, she wasn't just competing with his reputation. She was up against an industry-changing concept that had critics, investors, and high-profile clientele already placing bets on his success. It was infuriating. But more than that, it was dangerous. Because if Zachary successfully pulled this off, he wouldn't just win. He'd bury her before she even had a chance to fight. Megan refused to let that happen. At dawn, she rolled out of bed, pulled on a hoodie, and headed straight to the restaurant's construction site. She needed clarity, needed to walk the space, feel it, remind herself that what she was building mattered. But when she arrived, Samuel was already there, standing in the middle of the unfinished dining room, a coffee cup in one hand and his phone in the other. He looked up as she entered. "Couldn't sleep." Megan let out a humorless laugh. "Not with Sterling pulling another stunt." Samuel sipped his coffee. "He's good at that." She crossed her arms. "I don't just want to compete with him, Samuel. I want to beat him." Samuel smirked. "Then we need to be smarter." Megan exhaled, pacing. "We need something that makes our restaurant impossible to ignore. Something that makes people choose us over his flashy concept." Samuel leaned against a stack of unopened kitchen equipment. "Tell me what you're thinking." Megan stopped pacing, turning toward him, her mind working at full speed. "Zachary is promising exclusivity, spectacle, an experience that's never been done before," she said. "But he's also alienating people." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Megan gestured toward the construction. "People are obsessed with luxury and fine dining. But real food lovers, they care about authenticity. The experience Zachary is creating will be for the elite. High-end clients who want status more than substance." She took a deep breath. "So we make our restaurant the opposite." Samuel's smirk grew. "Accessible, intimate, immersive." Megan nodded. "Exactly. We don't just give people a meal. We give them a story, a place where they don't just eat. They feel like they're part of something. Every dish should have meaning. Every detail in the space should make them feel connected to the food, the people, and the process." Samuel chuckled. "You're talking about creating a culinary movement. Not just a restaurant." Megan met his gaze. "Why not both?" Samuel considered her for a long moment, then grinned. "I like it." Megan felt her adrenaline spike. This was it. This was how they'd win. But then, her phone buzzed. She frowned, pulling it from her pocket, and when she saw the caller ID, her stomach dropped. Zachary Sterling. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Samuel noticed. "You gonna answer?" Megan exhaled sharply. "No." She hit ignore and shoved the phone back into her pocket. Zachary could wait. She had work to do. Zachary stared at his phone as the call went to voicemail. A slow smirk spread across his face. She was ignoring him. Interesting. James sat across from him, flipping through reports. "She's pushing forward with her launch, no delays." Zachary set his phone down. "I expected as much." James hesitated. "She's planning something different. She's not trying to match your concept. She's creating something unique." Zachary tapped his fingers against the desk. "What is it?" James sighed. "We don't know yet, but whatever it is, she's being very careful about keeping it under wraps." Zachary leaned back, amused. Megan Collins was playing smart. He liked that, but she was still playing against him. And in the end, there would only be one winner. Megan spent the next 3 days locked in meetings. She brought in marketing experts, industry consultants, and some of the most passionate chefs she knew. Every decision was meticulous. The menu, designed to be interactive. Guests would be able to engage with the food, learn about its origins, even experience live cooking elements at their tables. The atmosphere, intimate, warm, designed to make every diner feel like they were stepping into a story. Not just a restaurant, the branding, bold, unexpected, instead of exclusivity. They would sell inclusivity, a place where everyone could experience something special by the end of the 3rd day. Samuel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "You're exhausting." Megan grinned. "You love it," he sighed. "I do." Then he smirked. "But you know Sterling is going to react to this." Megan nodded. Let him. Because now, for the first time, she was ahead of him, and she intended to keep it that way. Later that night, Zachary sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. And then, another headline. Megan Collins reveals new restaurant concept. A revolutionary take on dining. Zachary's eyes narrowed as he read. She had flipped the script. Instead of chasing exclusivity, she had created the opposite, and it was working. For the first time, he was the one playing catch-up. His grip on the report tightened. Megan Collins had just turned the game on its head, but he wasn't out yet, not even close. He picked up his phone, dialing a number. When the person on the other end answered, he said one sentence. It's time to put the pressure on. Because if Megan thought this was over, she had no idea what was coming next. Megan had felt pressure before. She had felt the weight of long shifts, of balancing bills, of carrying responsibility on her shoulders. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a war, and the battle lines had been drawn. She could see it in the way investors suddenly pulled back, their emails becoming vague and their responses delayed. She could hear it in the way whispers spread through the industry, rumors about how opening against Zachary Sterling was a financial suicide mission, and she could feel it in the way her suppliers, ones she had already locked in contracts with, were suddenly unavailable. Zachary was tightening the noose, and he was damn good at it. Megan stormed into Samuel's office, slamming a folder onto his desk. We just lost another supplier. Samuel looked up from his laptop, his face unreadable. Which one? Megan exhaled sharply. Hudson Meats. They were supposed to be one of our main providers. Samuel leaned back, rubbing his jaw. That's the 3rd one this week. Megan already knew why. She crossed her arms, her voice tight. Zachary got to them. Samuel sighed. Probably. Megan clenched her jaw. How is this even legal? Samuel shrugged. It isn't, but proving it, that's a whole different fight. Megan paced the room, her frustration boiling over. So what? We just let him win. Samuel watched her, his expression unreadable. No. She stopped pacing. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. We adapt. Megan took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. How? Samuel smirked. We hit him where he's not expecting. Megan frowned. Which is... Samuel stood, walking to the window. Sterling is predictable. He controls the industry by locking down the top players, the best suppliers, the most powerful investors, the critics who shape public opinion. He turned back to her. But he's not looking at the people outside that bubble. Megan narrowed her eyes. What are you saying? Samuel's smirk grew. I'm saying we build this from the ground up. We don't rely on the elite suppliers that Sterling is manipulating. We go local. We source from small businesses, independent farms, and producers that he doesn't even see as competition. Megan's mind started racing. Smaller suppliers meant more authenticity. It meant a stronger connection to the food, to the process. It meant telling a story that Zachary couldn't replicate. No matter how much money he threw at it, she felt a new kind of energy take hold of her. Samuel saw it too. Now you're thinking like a winner. Megan exhaled sharply. All right, let's do it. Meanwhile, at Sterling Enterprises, Zachary sat at the long conference table, his hands clasped in front of him as his legal team reviewed the latest contracts. One of his executives, a sharp-dressed man named Victor Grant, cleared his throat. The suppliers are locked in. We've made sure they're exclusive to us. Collins won't be able to access them. Zachary nodded. barely acknowledging the words. He already knew that. That wasn't what he was focused on. James, who had been silent for most of the meeting, suddenly spoke up. "We have a problem." The room stilled. Zachary's eyes snapped to him. "Go on." James slid a report across the table. "Collins is shifting her strategy. She's moving away from corporate suppliers. She's using local farms, independent vendors, family-run businesses." Zachary's fingers tapped against the desk. James continued. "It's actually brilliant." Zachary arched an eyebrow. James sighed. "She's creating something organic, personal, and people are already talking about it. She's getting press for supporting local businesses. The narrative is shifting. People love the idea of an intimate, handcrafted experience." A muscle in Zachary's jaw tightened. Megan Collins wasn't just adapting. She was outmaneuvering him. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes darkening. "She's resourceful," he murmured. James hesitated. "What do you want to do?" Zachary was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, adjusting his cuffs. "I want to see her," he said finally. James blinked. "You, what?" Zachary smirked. "Set up a meeting." James hesitated. "I don't think she'll—" "Make it happen," Zachary interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. If Megan Collins wanted to play at this level, then it was time they had a real conversation. Megan had zero interest in meeting with Zachary, so when James called and asked if she'd be open to a discussion, she almost laughed. "No," James sighed. "Megan, I really think you should—" "Goodbye, James." She hung up, but she should have known Zachary wouldn't take no for an answer, because later that evening, as she locked up the construction site, she turned and found him standing at the entrance, Zachary Sterling, leaning casually against the doorframe, dressed in his signature tailored suit, watching her like he had all the time in the world. Megan's blood boiled. She squared her shoulders. "What the hell are you doing here?" Zachary smirked. "We need to talk." "No, we don't." He pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Megan crossed her arms. "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I not playing by your rules? Must be frustrating." His smirk didn't falter, but there was something dangerous in his eyes now. "I admire your resilience, Megan," he said smoothly. "But let's be clear. You're stepping into an arena you don't fully understand." Megan took a step forward. "Okay?" Standing toe-to-toe with him. "You think I don't understand. You tried to cut me off, tried to cripple my business before it even started, and now that I've found another way, you suddenly want to talk?" Zachary's smirk faded, just for a second. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. "You really don't know when to quit." Megan's voice was steady. "No, I don't." Silence stretched between them. Then Zachary smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "All right, Collins, let's see if you can keep up." And just like that, he turned and walked away. Megan watched him go, her heart pounding. She knew, without a doubt, this was far from over. Megan's fists were clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. She stood there, watching as Zachary disappeared into the night. His arrogant smirk burned into her mind. He thought he could control this, that she would bend to his will like everyone else in his world, but she wasn't one of his pawns. She was his competition, and she wasn't backing down. Megan inhaled sharply, forcing herself to calm down. Getting angry wouldn't help. Winning would. She turned back toward the construction site, locking up the doors. But something in her gut twisted. Zachary wouldn't have shown up in person if he didn't have something planned, and that scared her more than anything. The next morning, Megan was up early, her mind already racing. She needed to stay ahead. She met with Samuel and Danielle over coffee, spreading out the latest numbers and reports across the table. "We're picking up momentum," Samuel said, sipping his espresso. "The media loves the idea of a locally sourced, immersive dining experience. We're already seeing interest from high-profile food critics," Danielle smirked. "And more importantly, people care. We're not just another fancy restaurant. We're something real, something people can connect with." Megan nodded, but she could still feel the weight of last night's encounter. Zachary wasn't just going to let her succeed, he was going to fight, and she had to be ready. That afternoon, the first real hit came. Megan was reviewing the final details for their grand opening when one of her managers rushed in, panic in her eyes. "You need to see this." Megan frowned, taking the tablet from her hands. The screen was filled with headlines. Is Megan Collins's restaurant a financial disaster in the making? Industry experts say Collins's concept lacks stability. Will it survive? Inside sources reveal growing doubts about Collins's vision. Megan's stomach dropped. She scrolled through the articles, her blood turning ice cold. Every single one painted her as reckless, naive, and destined to fail. And worse, they all quoted anonymous sources from within the industry. Megan slammed the tablet down. This is him. Samuel, who had been reading over her shoulder, let out a low whistle. It's a classic play. He's planting doubt before you even open. Danielle scowled. What a petty bastard. Megan clenched her jaw. We need to respond. Samuel shook his head. No, we don't. She turned to him, eyes blazing. Samuel, he's trying to destroy us before we even get started. Samuel remained calm. Exactly. And that means he's afraid. Megan hesitated. Samuel leaned forward. If we panic now, we're playing his game. We don't need to defend ourselves. We need to deliver. Megan exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think. Samuel was right. Zachary wanted her to waste time explaining herself, proving she belonged. But she didn't owe anyone an explanation. She just had to win. She met Samuel's gaze. All right, no response. We focus on the launch. Danielle grinned. Now that's what I like to hear. But even as she said it, Megan knew deep down. Zachary wasn't finished, and she was right, because the next hit was so much worse. It started with a single phone call, then another, then 10 more. By the end of the day, Megan was standing in her office staring at a growing pile of cancellation notices. Tell me this is a joke, she said, her voice dangerously low. Her assistant shook her head. It's real. We're losing investors. Suppliers. People are pulling out left and right. Megan's fingers dug into the desk. Why? The assistant swallowed. They're saying they don't want to be involved in something unstable. Megan knew exactly what that meant. Zachary's whispers had turned into fear, and people were jumping ship. Her breathing was sharp, uneven. This was sabotage. Samuel walked in a few seconds later, already holding his phone. I just got off the phone with a few people. They won't say it directly, but Sterling is putting pressure on them. He's making it clear that working with us means losing out on deals with him. Megan's stomach twisted. He's blacklisting us, Samuel sighed. He's making sure no one bets on you. For the first time, the weight of it all felt crushing. She had fought so hard, worked tirelessly, and now Zachary was pulling the rug out from under her, making sure she collapsed before she even had the chance to stand. A breaking point, and he knew it. That night, Megan sat alone in her apartment staring at the city skyline. Her phone sat on the table, untouched. She could call Zachary. She could demand that he stop, but that would be admitting defeat. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for the first time in weeks. She felt tired of fighting, tired of proving herself. And that's when her phone buzzed. Her heart jumped. But when she glanced at the screen, it wasn't a headline. It wasn't a cancellation notice. It was a text message from Zachary Sterling. Her pulse spiked as she read it. We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow. No demands, no threats. Just a simple invitation. Megan stared at the message for a long moment, then exhaled. She had two options. Walk away or walk straight into the fire. And deep down, she already knew what she was going to do. She picked up her phone, and she typed back one word. Fine. Because if Zachary Sterling wanted a meeting, she was going to give him hell. Megan arrived at the meeting location exactly on time. Not a minute early, not a minute late. Zachary had chosen a high-end rooftop bar in the heart of Manhattan, a place where deals were made over crystal glasses of whiskey and hushed conversations. The city skyline stretched behind him as he sat at a private table, exuding the same effortless confidence that had made him a titan in the business world. Megan refused to be intimidated. She approached the table, back straight, chin high. She was not the same woman he had humiliated months ago. Zachary looked up as she reached him. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Megan. She didn't respond. She simply pulled out the chair and sat down. Zachary smirked. Still angry, I see. Megan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. No, I'm focused. Zachary's smirk didn't fade. Good. That's exactly what I wanted. A waitress approached, but Megan waved her off. I'm not staying long. Say whatever it is you need to say. Zachary studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much of the truth he was willing to reveal. Then, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. I'll get straight to the point, he said. Your restaurant is falling apart. Megan's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. He continued, suppliers are dropping you. Investors are getting cold feet. Your name is being dragged through the industry as a reckless gamble. He tilted his head. How long do you think you can keep this up? Megan exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. If you called me here just to gloat, you're wasting your time. Zachary chuckled. I didn't. He leaned forward slightly. I called you here to offer you a way out. Megan's pulse spiked. A way out. Zachary nodded. Walk away. Sell me your restaurant concept. Megan blinked. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. Then she laughed. An actual laugh, sharp and disbelieving. You think I'd sell to you? Zachary's expression remained calm. Yes. Megan shook her head, still stunned by his audacity. You've spent weeks trying to crush me, and now you want me to hand you everything. Zachary's voice was even. I'm offering you security. You walk away with a profit instead of a failure. Megan leaned in, her voice low. Let me make one thing clear, Zachary. I would rather watch my restaurant burn to the ground than let you put your name on it. For the first time, something in his gaze flickered. Annoyance? Amusement? She wasn't sure. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. You're stubborn. Megan smirked. And you hate that you can't control me. Silence stretched between them. Then Zachary's lips curled into a smirk of his own. Fine, he said, his voice smooth. Then I suppose we'll see who survives this war. Megan stood up, smoothing her hands over her blazer. We will. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She had just rejected an offer that most people would kill for, but she didn't regret it, because this wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. The next few days were brutal. The industry was against her. The suppliers who remained were hesitant. Investors were calling to reconsider their involvement. The pressure was crushing, but Megan, she refused to break. She worked harder, meeting with small business owners, pulling in every favor she had left. She wouldn't let Zachary win. Samuel, however, was more practical. You can't keep running on sheer willpower, he told her one night as they sat in the office, surrounded by spreadsheets and contracts. Megan exhaled sharply. I don't have a choice. Samuel frowned. There's always a choice. Megan shook her head. Not this time. But deep down, she knew he was right. She needed a game changer. And fast. That game changer arrived in the form of a phone call. It was late. Megan had just finished another exhausting round of meetings when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something told her to pick up. Hello, a deep voice responded. Is this Megan Collins? She straightened. Who's asking? The man chuckled. My name is Graham Whitmore. I represent an exclusive network of investors looking for something different in the culinary world. Megan's pulse spiked. Whitmore was a legend. He didn't just invest in restaurants. He built icons. And he had called her, What can I do for you, Mr. Whitmore? She asked carefully. Whitmore's voice was smooth. I read about your restaurant, and I believe we may have a mutual interest. Megan swallowed hard. This could be everything. The next evening, Megan sat across from Graham Whitmore in a private dining room at one of his flagship restaurants. He was older, sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that made people listen. He studied her carefully. Tell me why I should believe in you, Miss Collins. Megan inhaled. This was her moment. She didn't talk about numbers or competition. She talked about her vision. I don't want to create another restaurant for the elite, she said. I want to create something real, a place where food tells a story, where people connect, not just with the cuisine, but with the experience. Whitmore was silent. Then slowly, he nodded. I like you, he said. You remind me of myself when I was younger. Megan's heart pounded. Then Whitmore leaned back in his chair, smiling. I'll invest. Megan barely stopped herself from gasping. She gripped the edge of the table. You will, Whitmore nodded. But on one condition. Megan swallowed. What condition? Whitmore's smile sharpened. You beat Zachary Sterling at his own game. Megan grinned. I planned to. Meanwhile, at Sterling Enterprises, Zachary sat at his desk, his fingers drumming lightly against the wood. James entered the office, looking uneasy. Zachary barely glanced up. Tell me. James cleared his throat. Megan Collins just secured an investment from Graham Whitmore. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Zachary's fingers stopped drumming. James shifted uncomfortably. This changes things. Zachary exhaled slowly. Megan Collins had just turned the tables, and for the first time in years, Zachary Sterling felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He was losing control. Megan had faced setbacks before. She had been humiliated, underestimated, and nearly pushed out of the industry before she even got started. But this time, she wasn't the one fighting from behind. She was finally on the attack, with Graham Whitmore backing her. Everything changed overnight. The media pivoted. Where once they had doubted her, now they were calling her the rising star of the culinary world. Investors who had once abandoned her suddenly wanted back in. Suppliers, sensing a shift in power, returned her calls. And most importantly, for the first time, Zachary Sterling wasn't dictating the game. He was reacting to it at Sterling Enterprises. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. Zachary sat at the head of the table, listening as his executives scrambled to contain the damage. She's flipped the entire narrative, one of them said. With Whitmore's name attached to her restaurant, public perception is changing. She's now being positioned as a visionary, another added. People love the underdog story. They want her to succeed. Zachary remained silent, his fingers interlocked, his expression unreadable. James cleared his throat. There's more. Zachary's eyes flicked toward him. James hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. She's moved up her launch date. Zachary's jaw tightened. By how much? James exhaled. She's opening 2 weeks before you. A heavy silence fell over the room. This wasn't just a business move. This was a declaration of war. For the first time in his career, Zachary Sterling was being outmaneuvered. His grip on the folder tightened. But when he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, too smooth. All right, he said. Then let's make sure she doesn't survive opening night. Megan knew exactly what Zachary was going to do. She had studied him long enough. He would try to sabotage her. He would pull every dirty trick in the book to ensure her opening was a disaster, which meant she had to be ready for anything. Samuel, however, was concerned. You do realize he's not going to sit back and let this happen, right? He said as they reviewed the final details of the launch. Megan smirked. Of course not. Danielle, who was sharpening knives in the corner, snorted. So what's the plan? Megan leaned forward. We control the narrative before he does. We get the right people in the room. We make opening night so unforgettable that even Zachary Sterling can't erase it. Samuel raised an eyebrow. You're thinking press. Megan nodded. Not just any press. The kind that matters. The kind that won't be bought or swayed by Sterling's influence. Samuel rubbed his chin. Food critics with integrity. People who can't be intimidated. Danielle smirked. That's a short list. Megan smiled. I know exactly who to invite. She picked up her phone and made the call that would change everything. Opening night, the restaurant was packed. The warm, intimate atmosphere was perfect. Every detail meticulously crafted, from the open kitchen concept to the way the dishes were plated. The energy in the room was electric. Megan stood in the back, watching everything unfold. She should have felt nervous. But instead, she felt unstoppable. Samuel nudged her. The critics are here. Megan followed his gaze and saw them. Some of the most respected names in the food industry, people who could make or break a restaurant, and they looked intrigued. Megan took a deep breath, stepping forward. Time to give them a show. She moved through the restaurant, interacting with guests, watching as the food was brought to life. Every dish had a story, and people weren't just eating. They were experiencing something new. Then, the moment of truth arrived. One of the top critics, Eleanor Walsh, lifted her fork and took the first bite. The room stilled for a moment. There was only silence. Then, a slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. She looked up, met Megan's gaze, and nodded. That was it. That was everything. The tension in Megan's chest eased. They had done it, meanwhile, across town. Zachary Sterling sat in his empty restaurant. The grand opening had been delayed, his name overshadowed by the one woman he had tried to destroy. His phone buzzed. It was James. "She did it," James said. "The critics are already calling it one of the most innovative restaurants in the city." Zachary clenched his jaw. For the first time in his life, he had lost, and he had lost to her. His grip tightened around the glass in his hand. Megan Collins had beaten him at his own game, and yet, as much as he hated it, he couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of respect, because Megan Collins hadn't just won. She had earned it. He let out a slow exhale, staring out at the city skyline. Then, almost against his will, a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Damn you, Collins," he muttered under his breath. And for the first time in years, Zachary Sterling wondered if losing to her might have been the best thing that ever happened to him. Megan should have been celebrating. Her restaurant was a success. The critics had raved about it. The food was praised as bold, innovative, and deeply personal. Reservations were already booked weeks in advance. And for the first time since this battle began, Megan felt like she had won. And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't quite relax, because Zachary Sterling wasn't the kind of man who simply accepted defeat. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Megan walked into her office at the restaurant, already preparing for another day. But as soon as she stepped inside, she saw Samuel standing by her desk, arms crossed, expression tight. Her stomach dropped. "What happened?" Samuel exhaled, handing her a folder. "You need to see this." Megan took it, flipping it open. Her pulse spiked. Inside were legal documents, more specifically, a lawsuit. Zachary Sterling was suing her. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the accusations. Intellectual property infringement, trade secret violations, unfair business practices. Her hands tightened around the paper. "This is insane." Samuel nodded grimly. "He's playing dirty." Megan's jaw clenched. "No, he's trying to drag me down in court because he couldn't beat me in business." Danielle walked in, frowning. "What's going on?" Samuel sighed. "Sterling's suing us. He wants to force Megan into a legal battle that'll cost her millions, even if it's completely baseless." Danielle cursed under her breath. "He's that bitter." Megan dropped the papers onto her desk, feeling a wave of anger rise in her chest. "He's not bitter. He's scared. Because this wasn't an act of a confident man. This was an act of desperation. And if Zachary Sterling thought she would just roll over, he was about to be very disappointed. Across town, in his high-rise office, Zachary sat at his desk, watching the city below. James entered, looking cautious. "I assume you heard that Collins is already fighting back?" Zachary smirked. "Of course she is." James hesitated. "You really think this lawsuit is necessary?" Zachary glanced at him. "It's not about winning the case, James." James exhaled. "Then what is it about?" Zachary leaned back, fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "It's about control." James didn't respond. Zachary tilted his head. "Do you know why I've built everything I have?" James sighed. "Because you hate losing." Zachary smirked. "No." He picked up a glass of whiskey, swirling the liquid. "Because I understand power." James watched him carefully. "And what does power tell you about Megan Collins?" Zachary's smirk faded slightly. It told him that she was a problem he hadn't anticipated. It told him that for the first time in his entire career, he had underestimated someone. And yet, it also told him that he wasn't done with her. Not yet. Megan wasn't stupid. She knew that fighting Zachary in court would drain time, energy, and resources. So instead of falling into his trap, she made her next move publicly. That night, she sat down for an exclusive television interview, the kind that would be seen by millions. The interviewer leaned forward. "Megan, your restaurant is one of the most talked about establishments in the country right now. But with this lawsuit from Zachary Sterling, some people are wondering, are you worried?" Megan smiled, her voice steady. "No." The interviewer raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem concerned." Megan exhaled, choosing her words carefully. "This lawsuit isn't about fairness. It's about intimidation. Zachary Sterling isn't suing me because I did anything wrong. He's suing me because I succeeded." The interviewer nodded. "So you're saying this is personal?" Megan's expression didn't waver. Absolutely, but here's the thing. I won't be bullied. The interviewer smiled. That's a bold statement. Meghan met the camera's gaze. It's the truth. By the next morning, her words were everywhere. Social media exploded. People rallied behind her, calling out Zachary's tactics for what they were. A bitter man trying to destroy a woman who outplayed him. Headlines dominated the news cycle. Meghan Collins stands strong against corporate bullying. Zachary Sterling faces backlash for frivolous lawsuit. Public support grows for Meghan Collins amidst legal battle. And just like that, the lawsuit backfired. Inside his office, Zachary scrolled through the news. James sat across from him, smirking. That didn't go as planned, did it? Zachary's jaw ticked, but he remained composed. James continued, Public sentiment is against you. Investors are questioning your judgment. Some of them are already pulling out of your new restaurant. Zachary set his phone down. I know. James studied him. Then why don't you look more upset? Zachary leaned back, his fingers steepled. Because deep down, he realized something. Meghan Collins wasn't his enemy. She was something else entirely. She was his equal. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement. A slow, knowing smirk pulled at his lips. Well played, Collins. He picked up his phone and made the final move. Meghan was exhausted. Between running the restaurant, dealing with legal battles, and defending herself in the public eye, she barely had time to breathe. So when her phone rang late that night, she almost ignored it until she saw the name on the screen, Zachary Sterling. Her heart pounded. She hesitated, then picked up. What do you want? A deep chuckle. Hello to you too. Meghan exhaled sharply. If you're calling to threaten me, don't waste your breath. Zachary's voice was smooth. Relax, Collins. I'm not here to fight. She frowned. Then why are you calling? A pause. Then, I'm dropping the lawsuit. Meghan froze. She wasn't expecting that. Zachary continued. You won, you proved your point, and I respect that. Meghan's fingers tightened around the phone. So that's it. You're just giving up. A low chuckle. No, Collins. I'm just changing the game. Meghan swallowed. What does that mean? A pause, then. I'll see you soon. And with that, he hung up. Meghan stared at the phone, her pulse racing, because somehow she knew. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning.